Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. We will have our guest, Dr. Benjamin Rosman from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, as well as Singularity University, South Africa, give some remarks on the future of automation and the future of work. But first, I shall introduce our esteemed panel for today. We have our United States Transhumanist Party officers, our Secretary, Pavel Ilin, our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia. We have our 2020 US Presidential Candidate and Director of Marketing, Charlie Cam. So welcome to our US Transhumanist Party officers. We also have a special guest, our US Transhumanist Party ambassador in Spain, as well as our technology advisor, Dr. Jose Cordero. Welcome. We have Newton Lee, who is the chairman of the California Transhumanist Party and also the education and media advisor for the US Transhumanist Party. And from AFT Technoprog, our special guest, Didier Kernel. And we are very pleased to have them join us today. And also welcome to Inessa Lee of the California Transhumanist Party, who has joined us just now. We have an excellent panel lined up. And I want to briefly introduce our guest, Dr. Benjamin Rosman. So he is an associate professor at the School of Computer Science and Applied Mathematics at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. He was also, in March 2018, the recipient of a Google Faculty Research Award, which was the first such award in machine learning in Africa. And he is a faculty member at Singularity University, South Africa. He speaks at many conferences. He writes extensively on issues such as artificial intelligence, decision theory, automation. And he recently had an article that was co-authored with our friend and US Transhumanist Party foreign ambassador in Australia, Peter Zing. And you may recall we had Peter Zing on in July in one of our virtual enlightenment salons. So this article was published on August 6th, 2020. It's called The Global Work Crisis, Automation, the Case Against Jobs, and What to Do About It. And with that, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Benjamin Rosman for his remarks.
Hey, thanks for having me here. It's quite an honor and a privilege. Yeah, I've heard a lot about you guys, particularly through my work with Peter. And yeah, it's good to be here. So this was all precipitated mainly by those articles that I started writing with Peter. And so I think maybe just to kind of set the scene for that a little bit, I'll give a little bit of the background of the kind of work that I do. So in my kind of day job as an academic, I run a research lab, and our big focus there is on the intersection of machine learning and robotics. And that area of artificial intelligence is about autonomous decision making. So where like a lot of what you hear about, or the bulk of machine learning that you would hear about, follows more the vein of trying to make predictions, whether this is like identifying what's in an image or translating someone's speech or something like that. Really, the kinds of questions we care about are more about longer term decision making, right? So if you look at an image, you've got to make a decision, is there a cat or a dog in it or something, right? But that's fundamentally an uninteresting decision from the perspective of what we understand as humans, where, if I'm trying to decide something, whether it's, some important life decision or something as simple as turn left, turn right, drive straight, right? The important thing to think about there is these kind of long-term effects. What you do now has ramifications for what you do in the future, and like that in turn will affect the way that the world evolves from that point. So a lot of the work that we're interested in is really around that kind of space. So it involves what is done in the rest of machine learning about making predictions, but you do that towards the idea of making better decisions, which has all these interesting problems around, sometimes you need to do something which in the short term might seem suboptimal, but it puts you in a better position to get a better win in the long run. So with that kind of work that I do, and with all the talking I do, obviously I come up against questions around, jobs being automated away and that sort of thing, which is, I think, a very well-founded concern. And this is something that, particularly as a roboticist, people always come and say, oh, you're going to build a robot that serves food in a restaurant, so that'll put me out of work. And what do you say about this? And that was something that never sat well with me, because it felt like I was actually doing something that was ultimately causing harm to humanity. And the funny thing with robotics is it's always a long-term thing. We never quite understand why people give us money in the short term. It's not like we've actually gone and changed all these industries that sci-fi predicted. But clearly that threat is there, and it's getting closer every day. And say autonomous driving is one notable example of that, which we'll talk more about later, I guess. This really got me to thinking, like, why are people so attached to their jobs? And if you take a step back and you think about the big picture of everything, how do jobs really work? Well, you've got that everybody, or practically everybody on the planet, has to have one. If you don't have one and you're not getting your salary, then you and your family probably won't be able to eat at the end of the month. And this is a trope in like every single TV show ever made, is like, oh no, I'm out of a job, I've got to go and sit and queue endlessly or borrow money from people and that sort of thing. This is really the core of essentially our engagement with society, is through the work we do. And again, if you take a think about that, it's a bit of a weird situation. And actually, I would argue it's an immoral situation, that you've got to do all these things. Now, the kind of people that can sit around, usually in webinars, in my case, at like 10 o'clock on a Sunday night, hi from Africa, we're often not the kind of people that are bearing the brunt of this fully. But like fundamentally, most people in the world are doing jobs that are bad for them physically in many cases. And this ranges from like things as terrible as child labor in a lot of places in the world, but all the way through to what adults do, but also emotionally and psychologically. If we're talking about the tropes associated with work, hating your job, and even that driving you to consider suicide, and all these kinds of unhappiness in life, that really is a staple for a huge percentage of the planet. And fundamentally, a lot of those jobs, they have to be done to power the global economy, to keep food production going and all sorts of amenities and services running. But if we're reaching this era of automation, is that not something we should do away with? If we look back on the history of humanity, is the fact that everybody was kind of enslaved into a job really something that we should be proud of? Then if you take the other side of things, right, we've got AI advancing all the time, and there's a lot of interesting applications there, and we often now talking more and more about using the kinds of techniques I was talking about earlier to, for example, apply them in healthcare. Whereas the applications we're already seeing in that space are around, you'll see these articles come out once in a while saying we can now detect a certain type of cancer with AI algorithms better than the average specialist can, and so on. But again, those are these short-term predictions. The long-term prediction is someone has a chronic illness and they need to come into a clinic once every 2 weeks, and you could be ordering different tests, you could be changing their medication, you could change their doses, maybe you need other opinions, or you need them to change their diet or exercise plans or something like that. So really, if you want like this long-term maintenance of people with a condition, this would be the kind of place that the sort of decision-making comes in. And obviously the same kind of problems arise if you want to run a business, right? That day-to-day decision-making, that's running a business. The exact same thing in politics or governance. You're trying to run a country. Again, you've got a series of decisions that have to be made. You might care about some long-term objectives. And this is really where, all the cutting edge areas in AI are sitting at the moment. So if you look at that and the rate that this is advancing, I like to quote the number, which is, it's a year or so out of date, but at that point, there was something like 100 publications in machine learning a day. Right? This is a ridiculously fast growing field. And if you take that and the speed of these developments, and the fact that actually if you own a company in basically any industry at this point, and you're not embracing AI, you're kind of losing the competitive advantage, right? So all the incentives are set up that you should be trying to automate as much as possible. So I work and talk to a lot of people like in various industries that are concerned about this. And you can see that, there's the small term thing about, we need to get this process working more seamlessly or tweak this so that there's few less humans in the loop. But ultimately, the trend is pretty clear. And then, I think there's this false narrative that you often hear from the big consulting companies, actually, which is for every one job automated away, you create 1.75 new jobs or something. And I call this a false narrative because I really think it is. It's possible that in certain sectors, this is true currently, but it's certainly not a long-term sustainable situation. Basically, again, with the kinds of technologies we're working with, it seems clear that there's fundamentally nothing that machines shouldn't be able to do and ultimately be able to do better than people can, right? And when you take that with the fact that I honestly don't think there's any fundamental law of the universe that says we need, there will always exist enough jobs for all people. And certainly the kind of rate of improvements of AI is certainly not decreasing anytime soon. When you put these things together, it becomes clear that we're approaching a point where more and more jobs are going to be automated away. And this is actually a problem, right? So a lot of people, and I'm sure you guys are used to this, just dismiss these kinds of concerns as some far-fetched thing of the future that's like, I don't know, a few generations away's problem. But if you look at it, take something like driving, which is one of, if not the biggest sector in the US, jobs-wise, right? So now if you get to a point, for purposes of conversation, I don't care if it's in the next month or next year or 10 years, but you get to a point where you automate away all of those jobs. Now, arguably, at the point you can do it properly, you should probably ban people from driving. There's something like 1.2 million people die in road-related accidents every year, which is barbaric, and we shouldn't allow that. So if you can get rid of this risk or cut it down dramatically, that's obviously a thing you should be doing. But when you do that, you're putting all these people out of work. Now, you can't tell me, firstly, that you're going to, again, the way consultants tend to dismiss this is, no, we're just going to upskill everybody to be software engineers. And I don't know if I've missed a step in that process of going from truck driver to software engineer, but I've never quite understood that logic there. But also fundamentally, if you look at some of the recent advances in AI, so there's a model that's been getting a lot of press lately called GPT-3, which was released by OpenAI, and they've been showing how you can do things like give a human language instruction and ask it to generate code in, pick random programming language of your choice here. And it can do that. Now, it's not perfect, and it's not meant to be perfect, but give that a couple more generations and it will be. And then where are all these software engineering jobs that we're talking about? So, there's a problem on that side. So now if you've got this issue where you've suddenly got all of your drivers in the country put out of work because it's more dangerous and it costs lives, and then probably, company bottom lines will be affected by this as well. If you can drive more efficiently, you use less fuel and you can do longer stints without needing brakes and so on. So I think all the incentives there line up for a company to embrace this, or potentially even for governments to embrace this. But then you end up with huge numbers of people out of work. And that's fundamentally not a sustainable position either. Coming from Africa, where we have, in many countries, we have very high unemployment rates, and it doesn't really make for a stable economy, right? There's a lot of fear that can be associated with it. If you've got something like we have, which is probably on the order roughly about a third unemployment, that's firstly, a huge burden on the system. And it's not clear what you do with that. But that's a lot of people suffering. And obviously with that comes a high crime rate, comes the potential for instabilities in governments and so on. So if you're sitting in a position where you're pretty convinced in the next decade or two, you're going to see significant percentages of your population put out of work, this feels like something we should really, really be worrying about. If we've got this kind of rise of technology, and this seems to be the place it's heading to, and that seems the most obvious kind of outcome, this really feels like something we should be anticipating. And particularly if we then connect this back to the previous point I was talking about, that work in itself isn't really something we should be proud of. Right? The whole system that we have where people have to spend all their time doing work. The argument we've been crafting around this is, instead of saying work is terrible, but we kind of ignore that because, that's never been a thing humanity's ever questioned since the agricultural revolution. But we do have this big threat of automation coming that's going to like strip us of our jobs and everything. I think actually combining these to say, actually, we do have a problem and we have the means to do something about it. If we anticipate this and we start putting the right structures in place to deal with it, then we've got the potential to use it to our advantage. And then we should be encouraging the acceleration of automation type technologies because it's actually moving us closer to the endpoint we want to be in, rather than this terrible situation we're in at the moment where there's kind of an oncoming train and everyone's just choosing to look the other way and assume we'll have infinite jobs created forever. So with all these kind of pieces in play, the argument that Peter and I have been working on together is really about trying to embrace what society should be looking like and almost treating this as like an impending threat that's possibly not existential, although I think the argument could be made either way for it. But if we don't do anything about it, I think that's what's going to happen. So instead, we need to be actually embracing this. We need to say, okay, now we're moving towards a state where we're building AI systems that can take more and more jobs. And again, the way these things tend to work exponentially is the kind of thing that's easy for people to scoff at until an entire industry is put out of work. And so, how do we start essentially future-proofing ourselves against something that I don't believe is a very distant future? And I think that there's a lot of space and a lot of ideas here that get thrown around, but fundamentally the two big challenges, like when you talk to anybody about kind of automation of jobs as a good thing, the two big threats that people perceive, one is, but this is my livelihood. You can't take that away from me. How will I eat? And the second is more around human value, which I actually think is a much more profound and somewhat challenging problem to deal with. So on the former, I'm not an economist, but there's a lot of thought around UBI, which seems like the right kind of system to be building towards. There's a couple interesting caveats here. I'm sure everyone's familiar with UBI, Universal Basic Income, and the idea that basically you should be getting some sort of, essentially, some standard amount of money from the government. But what we're talking about in this scenario is slightly different. Let me take a step back. There's two cases one needs to think about. One is, what does like an end game look like? Where would we like to be? And the other question is like, how do we get there? This is obviously challenging, and I recognize that. And anybody who's tried to make any profound claims that society should change in some way knows that they're coming up against an immovable object or something. But where we'd like to be, I think, is a bit different from the standard UBI case, which is that typically it's funded by certain taxes. Now, the challenge is if we're making the argument that fundamentally, in the longer term, there will probably be no jobs that humans are better at than machines. So if that's the case, then human work is the kind of suboptimal way of getting any task done. And I think this is why this kind of requires a bit of a rethink, because it's not like, okay, there'll be some jobs that exist and we can tax those people and use that to subsidize other people. I think fundamentally we want a system where nobody is actually obligated to work at all. And in fact, work doesn't even make sense in that context. That, doing something because it's adding value to an ecosystem is a bit strange when a machine can do it better. There's this aspect. And so, you've got to look at ways that UBI could be structured differently, possibly around some sort of value-added tax on purchases and so on. Actually, Peter and I are looking at the moment, organizing a hackathon to look at ways that this could be implemented. Then there's also the question of how to get there. And I think that involves questions around, starting to reduce work hours. And I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities that have come during this whole time of COVID, where you could look at, slowly scaling down, because we ultimately want to make a shift from where we are now to where we'd like to be. Anyway, those are all the kind of questions around the financial aspects. And there's also questions around value, which I think gets a lot more to the core of who we are as people. And this is an interesting thing, that if you talk to people, and almost ask someone to describe themselves, they'll usually say, well, so I'm an accountant at this company, and your job is so intrinsically tied to what you do for a living. And again, this is probably one of those things we've never stopped to look at and question and say, is that really healthy? Is this the way we should be defining ourselves? Because fundamentally, even if you really, really love your job, a decent sized chunk of it isn't something you'd probably want to be defining yourself as. So I think there's a broader question here around, how do we define ourselves in an absence of work? How do we give ourselves value in, or describe the value of ourselves. And I think there's a lot of aspects around this as well about what would you be doing if you didn't have to work. This doesn't necessarily mean you no longer get to do, if you have some aspect of your life you find very enjoyable, it's not saying you don't have to do this. It's just that doing this won't provide you any, financial gain in your life. So there's all the obvious things about, you spend more time with family, spend more time actually doing self-improvement and self-actualization, which again is something I think it's a separate conversation, but something people tend to not be very good at. But I think there are all these aspects. And, when you talk to people, you can drill down, and people do have things they actually want to do with their lives. And it's kind of daunting when you think about it at first of like, oh, yeah, what would I do with all these extra hours in my day? I'd probably go crazy and just binge watch Netflix all day or something. But like fundamentally, we've all got these passions that we usually put off because I could do that, but I need a bigger chunk of time. And so it gets pushed to the back of your list or the back of your mind or something. But, also because machines can do something and do it better than humans, it doesn't mean that it loses all value to us as well. For example, we've got chess playing computers and now Go playing computers and so on can beat the world's greatest players, but people still enjoy playing games of chess against each other, right? And so I think that there's this fundamental way we have to shift what we think about as the way we spend our time, the way we get value from that, and so on. And so this is actually one of the big challenges. And coupled with this again is we've got to look at the education system. So the response to this from most places, be it universities or policymakers, is okay, cool. The thing to do when jobs are getting automated, we've now got to teach everybody at school coding, which I think is a reasonable and useful thing to do for a variety of reasons. But as I mentioned earlier, that doesn't really get to the core of the problem because we could be just a few years out from never needing humans to code ever again, in which case that wasn't smart. And then are we always going to be playing catch up to fundamentally, again, what I would argue is that there's no job that ultimately a human could do better than a machine. And so my argument here would be we've also got to think about education. And probably what we're missing is the fact that nobody can answer this question about value in life. It means that these are things we should be thinking about from a school level, like teaching kids to actually think about their place in the world and value, and how do they value themselves, and how do other people value themselves, and how should you interact with each other, and what are like good principles for building community and building relationships and that sort of thing. And fundamentally, like when you view it in that light, it's kind of like, yeah, obviously we should be doing this, but clearly we're not, because people are so incapable of answering this question of what gives you value in life, and doing so in a way that's not intrinsically tied to work. So the kind of last point here is that in further reflection, if you look at something like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, actually, Peter and I reckon that a lot of those and the problems that arise actually come from work itself. If you could implement this kind of system, you would do away with, and when I say this kind of system, it's not like we have this exactly worked out as yet, but if you could address this issue, that really basically gives you a handle on a lot of the fundamental problems of poverty, of food security, of equality, and so on. And if you've got this view that some people are just born luckier than others, and that gives you all the advantages you need in life, like again, that's not the kind of thing we should be like proud of as a species. And the problem there, again, you can trace back to work, right? That's the thing that magnifies any small difference in your genetics or your upbringing. If you're lucky enough that it can get you into a good job and you can earn enough money, then you've got the freedom and the liberty to kind of play whatever games you want in the world, kind of based on the amount of money you're earning. But most people aren't lucky in that way. And so if we're fundamentally pushing the bar on who is lucky, that's going to become a smaller and smaller group that ultimately disappears as automation increases. And so regardless of where you are on that spectrum, this should be a primary aim, is to move to a point where work isn't the be all and end all. And we've got to structure society in such a way that that's true, and that we can actually flourish as a species, regardless of what's happening in the world of technology or in the country that you are, whether you can get employment or not. So I don't know if the idea here was that I gave a long ramble like that, but that's kind of my thoughts on the position that I'm trying to put forward here.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. These were quite insightful remarks, and they delve into a lot of the considerations regarding the technological future, its societal implications, its implications on the future of work, how we conceive of work, how we conceive of meaning in life. And I think at this point, we will have a very interesting question and answer session and conversation more generally based on all of the ideas that you've brought into the discussion. I would like to raise a question that Zach Richardson provided in our chat. He says, when the Industrial Revolution happened, people were claiming all jobs would disappear, and instead we have more. So he's asking, why is this different? Why won't we have infinite jobs forever? And I would add, at the turn of the last century, about 90% of the jobs were still in agriculture, and that very rapidly shifted toward predominance of industrial jobs, the kind of heavy labor that could be quite dangerous and unpleasant and deleterious to the individual over the long term. And yet now the vast majority of jobs are in the service occupations, and a good percentage of the population are knowledge workers. So at the very least, they're not subjecting themselves to significant physical hazards when they're performing their jobs. Of course, the jobs could still involve long hours. They could involve stress from interpersonal situations. But it does seem like what a job comprises in terms of the constituent elements has tended to improve over time. So what would you say is different about the coming wave of technologies and related societal phenomena?
So I love that question. And I think one thing I just do want to point out is that with the move to knowledge work, that is particularly a thing that you see in developed countries, and parts of them specifically, like in Europe and the US. For a large proportion of the world, work is still very much physical and very much like directly impacting on your longevity and your health and the health of those around you. And I think that that's an easy thing in these kinds of discussions to forget, but it's the reality faced by millions of people every day. But, I think getting to the core of the question, there's really two domains that humans have skills that contribute to, what we think of as jobs, and that's physical and cognitive. And the Industrial Revolution really handled a lot of the physical labor that people dealt with on a day-to-day basis. These huge factories just filled with people crammed in together doing, fitting parts together or sewing something and so on. And so with that happening, a lot of people moved then into the kind of production they were doing was in this cognitive space with, knowledge work and so on. But now if we're building the kinds of systems that can replicate what people do in that domain, that's really like diminishing the free space that people have to move around where there aren't machines competing against them. So now if you're sitting there and, whether it's, software engineering or aspects of business process optimization, or even working in a call center, right? All of these are things that people are actively pursuing, all the way down to legal analytics and medical analytics and making diagnoses and predicting the outcomes of cases or legal cases, or the best way to structure a legal argument to give you the highest probability of winning, right? All of these things are where a huge percentage of humanity adds their value. And, if these are the jobs that are now being challenged, and this, you can think of as even including, like, as I said earlier, running a business, even what we think of as like the creativity that goes into starting a startup, right? Fundamentally, there's no reason that any of these things, we won't have machines ultimately, and at probably some point in the not too distant future, again, that can do these better than humans. And so if that's the case, if all of our essentially cognitive advantages are then overtaken by machines, what does that really leave us with? I think in the more old-fashioned sci-fi days, you'd say, it leaves us with empathy and compassion. And yeah, but we know machines can do those things as well now. We've got a good handle on machine creativity and so on. And particularly with a lot of the work now in deep learning, where, a lot of the models are very much inspired by neuroscience, there really doesn't seem to be things that, there's certainly different timeframes of when certain skills will be realized. But I don't think there's anything that's fundamentally unautomatable at this point.
Now, one of the points that I have raised when speaking about the future of work and how automation and artificial intelligence will affect it is that artificial intelligence, at least in the approximate few decades, is likely to take over jobs in the knowledge work area that are repetitive, high throughput, that have some procedure or some set of approaches built into them. But it would be a lot harder for AI to perform cross-domain types of tasks where, for instance, a professional would bring in knowledge from a variety of different fields, say from economics, from law, from social science, from current events. And especially if that person is an entrepreneur or a manager at a company, that person would need to apply that knowledge to ever-changing situations, from, say, some sort of supply bottleneck to a political development to a personnel problem at the company. So the range of tasks for that kind of knowledge worker is so diverse and so distinct from one another that I wonder, until we have true artificial general intelligence, could those jobs really be automated away? Or would that be essentially the holdout set of jobs that are still going to remain for at least a few decades with us?
So that's very interesting, because if you look at kind of traditionally how machine learning works, the things that we know how to automate is anything where it's reasonably easy to get a large data set or to build a simulator. So, and that talks exactly to what you mentioned about things that are either very repetitive or a lot of people do them, right? Which is, fundamentally also the stuff people find easier to do. And so there is a lot of work at the moment on trying to figure out, okay, can I even learn how to build these simulators in an automated way? So if there's some problem that it's difficult for humans to build this thing, can we get machines to do it? That's one area that people are working on at the moment, because, as I said, the one thing would be to actually learn from data, but the other aspect would be this kind of applying creativity thing that we do, which is, this cross-domain thing where this is kind of like something else, which has given me experience in an indirect kind of way. But now there's also a lot of research being done, again, into these kinds of decision-making systems in what they call zero or few-shot learning, which is, sometimes you will never have seen that problem before and you need to come up with a solution to it. And this is almost what, in some limited context, that model I mentioned earlier, GPT-3, is capable of doing. You can give it an instruction that, it's never seen before, but it's trawled enough of the web and it's built complex enough models that it can pass what you want, and you can give it some instructions never seen before and it will figure out what you wanted out of it. Again, it's not perfect, but it gives us a reasonable indication of where things are going, probably in the reasonably near future. And so I think these kinds of less well-defined problems where, you think, how does a human solve a problem, the first time you start a company and you don't have any experience doing this before, and surely there's some aspect of luck, but then you also kind of randomly feel your way correctly through a few big decisions and that sort of thing, right? So replicating that kind of skill is difficult, and that's really where a lot of interesting cutting-edge research is at the moment. But yeah, that's certainly going to be the more holdouts, but I don't think those jobs are immune from automation by any means. I think it's just a more difficult research problem to get to them.
So you think fundamentally there will be a time when there could be a company, an actual multi-million-dollar company, where the middle manager could be an AI system, and the AI system will decide what tasks to assign to the workers, probably many of whom will be AI systems, what supplies to get, how to manage company policy, how to respond to regulatory issues that arise, all of those different aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's completely inevitable. And in fact, people always like to think, well, if you've got that, then you just have a very small management board at the top that make these very high level decisions, and then it's automation all the way down. But fundamentally, I don't even think that board is necessary. I don't think there's any reason why in the long term a company needs to have even a CEO in it. And I think this is what I would argue is a bit different from a lot of people who talk in this space, that they give this idea that there would ultimately just be some very small percentage of people on the planet that own all these companies. But again, if your AI systems are smart enough to be able to manage an entire multinational company, I don't think it needs the person on the top. And so, fundamentally, I think this is where this shift is required, because fundamentally, these are all just the same kind of long-term decision-making problems, right? So if you distinguish what happens if you're making these kinds of business decisions as the CEO versus as middle management, versus actually the long-term decision-making you make step by step as you're walking around day to day and putting your sandwiches together and getting into your car and driving somewhere. Fundamentally, those are all the same kind of decision-making problems. The only thing that's different is the amount of experience you have and how easy it is to gather that data. And so from a kind of technical perspective, if you can solve one of these convincingly, there's no reason you can't solve the others almost immediately.
Mm-hmm. So the technology for automation gives us a lot of power already. Now the question is acceptance, right? Because if you look at the medical expert systems, they are actually better in diagnosing and recommending solutions than medical doctors themselves. But patients, well, as well as some doctors, are reluctant to use it. Why? Because, in medical science, you like to understand the patient from a human point of view, right? People don't want to be touched by machines making decisions for 100% decisions. They want a human being. They want a human doctor who can tell you what to do because he or she is also human. That's the human touch that's missing right now from automation. Now, when you're talking about jobs, it's interesting because I was looking up the surveys. 85% of people hate their jobs. That's a lot. Okay. In fact, just you can ask anybody, right? If you win the lotto, $100 million, are you going back to work? Most people say, no way, I'm retiring, right? Why? That means they don't really love the jobs. Now, we have teachers, we have doctors or nurses who will say, yes, I'm going back to work tomorrow, even if I have won a lotto. In fact, that has been the case. They're going back to work because they love to take care of the patients. They love to help people, right? Mother Teresa will continue to work in the field, helping people. Doesn't matter if she has no money or she has been or she were a billionaire, right? It makes absolutely no difference. So the question is, why do people have to work? Well, it's because they have to make money. They have to buy a house, they have to buy a car, they have to take care of the kids, they have to get, go on a nice vacation, whatever, right? Whatever they do. That's not a bad thing, right? These are all good things that we can do. And then some people want to work so that they can make donations to their favorite charities, right? They can rescue dogs and cats from the street. If they don't have money, they cannot even help to rescue dogs and cats from the street. So there are many good reasons. There are many, maybe selfless reasons. There are also selfish reasons, all kinds of reasons why people have to work. Now, automation, it's going to change a lot, right? For example, you mentioned about software engineering, right? Of course, software engineers are great. They program computers, they program the robots to do things for us. But in 2015, Google, Adobe, and MIT researchers, they came together and decided to, Photoshop, everybody uses Photoshop. And you want to add features to Photoshop. You want to make sure that you don't introduce bugs to the new features. So they create a software program that can program Photoshop. Okay, so essentially you're correct. All software developers can be replaced by an AI, super intelligence software, because they can create software better than we do. So and those software can run for run a company, like the CEO of company or CFO, taking care of all the accounting and so on and so forth. In fact, we're already using AI in stock market, right? Automated stock, all kinds of things that they do with stocks. We're using AI already in insurance, right? Who can get insurance and why and for how much premium and things like that. So a lot of decision-making systems is already in place, including the military, by the way. So it's kind of scary because the decision, whether to make a life or death decision, people don't want to give that to a machine, and yet they are using machines and AI to help with a lot of decision making. And then for driving, again, you're right. Who wants to be stuck in traffic, driving to work, back and forth from work to home and so on? Nobody really. So they would say absolutely yes, self-driving is it. But if you want to take your favorite car and go, driving for fun, and then go to a destination, or maybe it's a vacation, whatever, then you shouldn't limit people from not having to be able to drive, right? So what I'm saying is that you're right. I mean, what is work and what is play? Maybe the solution, the idea is that work should be play. If work is play, if work is helping other people, then work is not really work. A job is not a job. It's actually a job is your what's it so called? It's a calling in life. If your calling is to become a medical doctor, that's a job. but it's not really a job.
Yeah.
It's your calling, right? If your calling is to become preacher, to spread, love, God is love, and so on, that's not a job either. That's a calling. You want to, create more love in the world, right? So I think if you are really passionate about making music, for example, that's not a job. Your life calling is to be a musician, is to make people happy, right? So these are the things I believe will be like the Star Trek universe. You join the Star Trek because you want to explore the universe, not because you need to make money. Okay, so that's the kind of utopia that we're aiming for, and automation is obviously the mechanism to achieve that kind of future. Because without automation, we have to work hard in the field, trying to get potatoes off the off the ground, and we have to do all this and that. We have no time to write a book. We have no time to make music, right? So we need automation for sure to do everything for us. Running companies, I mean, yes, if you're really excited about running a company, you should go ahead and do it. But if you don't, if all you care about is the product that helps people, then you don't need to run a company. You just use AI to run a company for you. You just have to come up with the product that people need, something like that. So I think, everything put together in place. If you think automation, artificial intelligence, work, play, having more time to write music, to write a book and a novel, having more time to spend with your family, your grandchildren, and do something nice to other people, go to church, things like that. I think, again, if you think about AI though, AI can do that too, but do they find it enjoyable? I'm not sure. Okay, people find things enjoyable because we're human beings. Machines are robots. I don't think they'll enjoy, doing things per se. Maybe in the future, yes, maybe they will. But for now, they're here to serve a purpose. The purpose can be really complicated, like running a multi-billion-dollar company, or very simple, just play chess. Okay, so
yeah. I mean, I completely agree, and I think that there's a lot to unpack there as well. Thanks for the comments. I'll try and not forget any of them. But I think to start off, I think I see no reason why machines wouldn't ultimately enjoy these things. That's certainly much further off than what I'm talking about at the moment. So let's leave that one aside for now. But I agree, there's a lot of people that enjoy what they're doing, get meaning out of what they're doing. A nurse, for example, and clearly not all of them, but a large number. And so the point isn't that like they shouldn't be doing this thing that gives them meaning. It's just that shouldn't be tied to their livelihood. And I think that what's really criminal is that I've got no idea what the numbers are, but I'm sure a huge percentage of the population globally don't have those passions or don't have the time to commit to those passions because they've got to do something they really don't care for because, that's the thing that makes them money. Maybe they love music, but they're never going to earn enough doing it to be able to support themselves and their families. And to me, that's actually criminal. Why should someone have to slave away for the bulk of their life doing something they don't care for at all? When they do have things that they would rather be doing. So I completely agree with you, and I would fully advocate that anyone who gets value out of the thing they currently do for a living, you should still be able to do that. It just shouldn't be tied to your financial well-being. So I think that's an important thing. The other thing was you were talking about kind of the way that these get adopted, and I think that's going to vary dramatically in different fields. So if you take driving, for example, I could easily see a case where they do the studies and they find that actually we could globally save 1 million lives a year by automating all driving, right? Then you'd have to be a monster to say, no, I think humans should still be able to drive, right? I think that there'd probably be a big industry in going to buy huge tracts of land and collecting a bunch of cars, and people would come over weekends or whenever and pay you a lot of money to drive around. Like, I'm pretty sure that kind of thing will exist in the future. But like, if there's a large number of lives at stake, okay, I mean, we're going through a pandemic now and it seems that doesn't even motivate people. But, if there's a large number of lives at stake, you could easily imagine somebody pushing for like immediate adoption. I think the reality is in many industries that it'll be a much more gradual thing. So if you look at, any kind of corporate industry, the company is heavily incentivized to automate. If it's going to save them money and improve productivity, they're going to have to automate. I can't see, depending on the at the moment we're going through and will be going through a difficult economic time, you're in that case, maybe you're going to have large numbers of layoffs. But I think in general it would probably be, jobs get automated, and just when people retire, they're just not replaced. And you'll find that over a longer period of time, you've just got a smaller and smaller percentage of the population employed. But there's other ways that I could imagine these kinds of things happening. So, for example, you gave the example of the medical diagnosis. Now, I could imagine with, take the US, for example, where, there's, I don't know the numbers, but a large number of lawsuits against doctors every year, right? A huge number of these things. Now, you could imagine like somebody saying, actually, we've got a very good diagnostic system in radiology. And now, as a way to protect you against litigation, maybe when you're discussing this case with that patient, you've also got to get the opinion of the AI, and you note in your notes what the AI's opinion was and why you agreed or disagreed with it. So the human's still giving the diagnosis to the patient, but maybe for legal reasons they've got to back up that the AI said it was X and I agreed, and that's what I spoke to the patient about. Right? Now, this again seems like the kind of thing that could be implemented overnight. That's going to save people a lot of money. That's probably going to reduce the number of faults or misdiagnoses. And actually, I think most patients and doctors would be okay with that. The problem is then a little bit down the line, you say, okay, then why do we need 10 radiologists at this hospital and not one? Right? If they don't need to spend all that time doing the diagnosis, they just check over what the machine's done, and they have, instead of having an hour meeting with this patient, they meet them for 15 minutes. And they can fit 4 times the patients in. And, we've got a higher success rate since the system was implemented. And I think with these kinds of gradual, like introductions of these systems, you'll see that unemployment starts climbing in a way that we don't really know how to deal with. If we just treat it in the more traditional setting of like, well, we'll just put pressure on the universities to offer more programs in whatever the cutting edge stuff is these days. But I don't think that's going to scale at all. And I think we're going to keep having these problems. I don't know if I got all your questions there, but
yeah, so. It's a very good point. Yeah, I love teaching, and I've been teaching for more than 20 years, both part-time, full-time, in between. So whenever I teach computer science, artificial intelligence, and video games. But when I'm teaching the kids, young minds, I always talk about philosophy, even religion, all kinds of things, because I ask them, why are you studying computer science? Are you using it to do good, for humanity? Are you going to help people using IT, or are you going to become a criminal, become a cyber criminal, trying to steal money from the banks, hack into people's accounts, things like that. So you see, there's always in the technology, you can use it for the good or also for the bad. So if you look at economies in a bigger picture, there's a professor in the London School of Economics. He said that economies around the world have increasingly become vast engines of producing nonsense. So basically, there are a lot of products out there that are just nonsense, right?
Yeah,
people are spending so much money and energy and creativity, so to speak, on creating apps that nobody wants, creating mobile games that make a lot of money, but who cares, right? I mean, so can we use the same talent, the resources and the money to create something more useful, like how to, protect the environment, how to, give us a better life, rather than just, you know what I mean? Rather than just making money for the sake of making money. Instead, we should use the money to actually produce some goods that are really helping humanity. So something like that.
I mean, I would think of that as like an orthogonal issue, that, if you get a lot of enjoyment in your life out of creating or playing silly games, then okay, cool. If that's your top priority, I don't think everybody needs to be. I mean, it'd be great, but I don't think we need to mandate that everybody's trying to do things to better humanity. But certainly, you would find orders of magnitude more people doing that if you freed them up from the nonsense they were doing on a day-to-day basis that they had to do sitting behind a desk, filling in TPS reports or something.
And I would also note there are a lot of types of work for which there does not currently exist a market incentive, but which we would agree would be valuable to perform, and we would all benefit from. It's just that kind of work has a lot of positive externalities that nobody in particular captures. But for example, during the time of this pandemic, I've been observing an increasing prevalence of litter, even here in northern Nevada, which generally didn't have this problem before. But a lot of people perhaps have decided they don't really care anymore about such basic principles as not littering in public. So when I run outside, I see this litter, it's unseemly. I don't want to touch it because who knows what sorts of pathogens it might contain. But nonetheless, it would have been nice if there were a program to clean up this litter. And at least in the short term, it could give employment to a lot of people. In the long term, I would hope robots can perform that kind of work. But I wonder, in cases where economic motives, commercial motives drive the adoption of AI, might there still be aspects of work that aren't being done because the market isn't fulfilling those needs, but perhaps there could be certain public programs that would actually hire people to go out and clean up litter? Or as another example, we have tremendous forest fires right now in the western United States. And a lot of that arises from the fact that there's a lot of dead, dry brush in the woods in California. So many people who are unemployed would probably be happy to be paid, say, $20 an hour to join crews that go into these forests and clear the dry brush, and that would reduce the wildfire risk. Do you see that potential mode of employment continuing indefinitely if there's public policy that facilitates the funding for it?
I think it's an interesting question, and it talks more to the kind of intermediate stage that I mentioned earlier, rather than kind of the ultimate end goal, which I think would be that, if we pursue automation hard enough and at the same time build the right kind of society, nothing needs to be doing this kind of giving a financial driver to people doing something. I think the core problem, and I completely agree with your analysis of the failure of the markets there, and I think that the problem there, and maybe the kind of more meta problem there really is that, we look at metrics like GDP as, our way of measuring everything from, how well countries are doing to actually driving a lot of decisions. I think that's probably not the right thing to be doing. You can look at a few places have started, experimenting with these like happiness indices and so on. And I think if you were actually measuring your country by a set of metrics that actually reflect the quality of life of the citizens of your country and so on, I think that would start talking to, a different way of thinking about this, right? So it's not that, okay, we've got to find some sort of a program that we can financially incentivize people to do something. But and then we've got to figure out how to make all the numbers work for that. But actually, like, if you're recording the right metrics and then you realize, wait, we're doing badly on this metric, that's a thing we need to fix. I think that changes the incentive scheme somewhat. So I think what you're proposing certainly makes sense with the current state of things. It's the kind of thing where hopefully we'd probably need to phase in and then at some point phase out as automation increases.
It's interesting because, Gennady, you talked about the forest fire and the prevention. That should be automated because it's dangerous, right, to go into those areas. Some of the areas are actually unreachable by human beings. So robots, firefighting robots. Yeah, absolutely, we need them.
We always talk about like the core, and historically, the core applications for robotics, they always spoke about as the 3 Ds of dull, dirty, and dangerous, or the jobs that we should be trying to automate. But fundamentally, I think everything's dull, dirty, and dangerous, and people should just be left to what they get their value from. But yeah, exactly, that is the kind of thing that we should, regardless, be trying to push automation to do better at. Because if there's a cost to human lives, cost to the environment, and so on, these should be all the no-brainers. That why are we not throwing the most sophisticated decision-making machines we've ever built at solving these problems? And that also baffles me.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me. I've got to pop off here. Thank you, Benji, for your work with animal rights. I believe that you said that you had a history in that. and your work with the automation of the future. I had a lot of questions and comments, all positive. I wondered if I do need to pop off of here now, though. I don't have any more time in my day, so I appreciate your conversation. Maybe you can email me. I was wondering, I wanted to leave you with the question of, have you looked at the psychology behind changing people's minds towards the future? Because I think that's the most important thing we can do, regardless of what the future holds or how we're going to get there. We know that the people of future are people who can change. And recently, with the Trump administration, when he was elected 4 years ago, he had sat with 50 coal miners telling them that he would put them back to work. We know that both mining coal is detrimental to the environment, it's detrimental to human health, and it clearly bases us into a psychology mold of people that are having more problem with change. So quickly, could you summarize how we can mobilize people psychologically for change instead of having them make great leaps that might in fact terrify them more? How can we look at societies that are still developing, that are not in the have not really strongly entered industrialization, look at the mindset that moves people towards that and the incentives that move towards that, and how can we then create flexibility of mind for people in today's modern industrialized countries?
Great,
I also have to go, but it has been a pleasure to be with all of you from so many countries, from South Africa, from Belgium, from France, from the USA, obviously, from Spain, and people even from Russia some time ago. So a pleasure, and I'll see you next weekend.
Bye, Jose.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, Liz, I think that's a really good question. It's something that we would like to be looking at. Just anecdotally, when Peter and I started working on this, I mean, it's something that I've been talking about. You know, if I'd be sitting in a panel and I get bored, and then I'll raise some point about work being immoral, and then that makes the panel more exciting all of a sudden. But when we started this line of work, we were really expecting, you know, a lot of pushback from people from all sorts of sectors. And we've actually found that that hasn't been the case. And people have actually been embracing this, even though it feels quite, to many people, fanciful and far off. And I think actually the big point is that, you know, people need an open, honest discussion about this. You know, well, what set me off in the first place was, again, a lot of the big consultancies saying, no, don't worry about this. We're just going to be creating more jobs. But people aren't stupid. They see what's happening, and they see that, you know, it's not foreign employment that's taking their jobs. It's more and more, it's machines and processes being automated. And you look at people in various companies and they're being told, no, you have to upskill into data science and now into AI, and you've got to figure out how to do robot process automation to streamline these workflows. And that's happening more and more. And I think this is a thing people are scared about. And I think what they need is more open, honest conversation about it, but also just to start bringing these threads together. So there's been a lot of excitement around UBI for a long time. It has been quite niche. I mean, all these topics are reasonably niche in their audiences, but, you know, I think the fact that there've already been a number of trials of these is a very positive sign. The fact that you're seeing in some places people starting to look at reducing the work hours and seeing if they can do that without changing the salaries and so on. I think these kinds of experiments are what people need to be seeing more of. I would actually love to do a study on how people's mindset towards the future is affected by these. And it makes sense was, you know, when you're in the kind of audience, you know, I talk to Singularity University quite a lot, and they're, you know, the kind of people that come to those events are the kind of people that feel very positively about this way of thinking. And it's interesting to see that the number of people aligned with that is growing pretty fast. I don't know what the numbers would be there, but you can just see it in kind of a daily engagement in like real life venues, but also online. And so I think I don't feel like I have a silver bullet for this, but I feel like if more mainstream people start taking up these kinds of conversations, which again was one of our motivations for writing our initial couple articles on this, because it's just something that feels like a crisis that we're barreling towards. And if we don't just get more people engaged, in fact, I often say to my audiences, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an economist, I'm a computer scientist, I work in automation, but like a lot of these big questions, they're not just for me to figure out what the answer should be. We really need a society-wide conversation. One of the examples I like to give around that as well is just what human values are. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the trolley problem from philosophy of, there's a train going down a track and it's going to hit and kill 5 people, but you can change the track that it's on, then it's guaranteed to hit and kill 1 person. What's the right thing to do? With the idea being that should you be trying to minimize the loss of life, but also in this case, you're directly responsible for the decision that was made and so on. And so there was a project out of MIT called the Moral Machine. So there's a website where it goes and gives you a bunch of these random scenarios. It says like, okay, would you rather your train or your car hit and kill 2 old ladies and 3 children, or 5 cats and a young person who also happens to be a bank robber, right? And it gives you these like random scenarios and to see what you would choose. And then they give this, and you can go and have a look there and see what the statistics are. And turns out, like wherever you look in the world, there's very different values. So I think in the UK, there's a preference for like a general society-wide preference for saving individuals who physically fit. Whereas if you look at, say, Nigeria, for example, there's a societal preference for saving high net worth individuals. And the interesting point to me there was if you look on a country by country basis, there's different values. And so again, I think just leaving this to like some people in the tech sector who honestly aren't trained in ethics and aren't trained in like, the way that societies interact with each other and so on. I think it's wrong to just be relying on that sector and kind of closing our eyes and saying like, oh, they'll figure it out eventually. We really want more people engaged in this conversation. We need to push that these kinds of conversations become more mainstream over time.
Right. I'd like to add that pop culture, right? Like movies, for example, make a huge difference. TV shows and movies, because in old days we had Star Trek from the 60s. It actually put that space exploration in front of everyday people, the whole country, in fact, the whole world. And then, of course, we need leadership, right? JFK actually led, the NASA to go to the moon. Without him, without the push, that would never happen, right? So we need strong leadership. That's why we want to elect transhumanists to the governments around the world, And also we need, pop culture, make more movies, write more books, more novels. Gennady has a novel, Zoltan has a novel. We need more novels. We need movies. We need Harry Potter kind of things that talk about transhumanism. And that will change people's mind. Really.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
In fact, I had a suggestion to Gennady about writing a novel. He brought in this proposition earlier, I remember. So Gennady, have you considered?
Well, perhaps at some point when I'm not as immersed in transhumanist politics and the day-to-day management of that, I could consider it. Another project I could consider as an expansion of my book, Death is Wrong, with more recent developments, more illustrations, more facts about advancements in the science of longevity, but we shall see. I am quite fond of philosophical deliberations regarding these kinds of questions, these kinds of dilemmas, and my philosophical position has always been there's always some third way, or more likely a million third ways, that eliminate the need to sacrifice anybody to save anybody else. So this trolley problem, it really is quite fanciful in the circumstances that have to transpire in order for people to be tied to both tracks, for the trolley to be unstoppable altogether or incapable of being derailed somehow, or that there would be an impossibility of some sort of rock or other obstruction being placed in the way. And I'm thinking also of how this would apply to autonomous vehicles. I know a lot of deliberations have taken place about this. What happens if there is a situation where the driver might die or a passenger might die? And clearly there are accidents where people die, and there will probably be accidents where people die involving autonomous vehicles. Thus far, any accidents of this sort were the result of human error. Even the infamous incident where an Uber vehicle ran over the indigent woman in Tempe, Arizona, that was a situation where Uber chose to disable the automated braking capabilities and the safety driver was not paying attention. So we haven't had a clear instance where the autonomous vehicle ever decided intentionally, per the system's programming, to collide with a human. And I really think it should be possible to program a system to avoid doing that intentionally. There could still be some sort of glitch, there could still be some environmental problem that the system could not overcome, of course, but there's enough flexibility in terms of real world action that you can always avoid intentionally sacrificing somebody. And I wonder what your thoughts on that are, Dr. Rosman.
So actually, a few things on that. Firstly, I thought it was amusing that you said, you know, you'll do the thing that you really want to do, which is write the book when you're not tied to all the automatable, bureaucratic and admin stuff. That was a nice point. But yeah, I think the points that I mean, obviously the point I raised with the trolley problem was just, in that case, just to show that the values of society aren't consistent. And I think this is an interesting point, because I agree, like the exact setting of that is somewhat artificial. But if you think, you know, there's always going to be a case where there's a trade-off. You know, I mean, let's just say, you know, just something simpler. How do I trade off speed versus driving more environmentally friendly, right? You know, if you think about the bottom line there, the one's got an impact on the environment. The other, you know, if a person's going to be late for a meeting, there could potentially be a lot of money lost. You know, I think in any case, we need an idea and a general framework for understanding our trade-offs between different values. And while I agree that the exact case of the trolley problem is probably unlikely to transpire in most cases, there is still like a much more general framework type question about how to think about this. We do sometimes joke in the robotics space that, you know, you've got this trolley problem of, you know, which do you decide between the two? And like to some extent, some of the automation companies are like, well, it doesn't really matter. Like whichever one the machine chooses would have been better than what the human did, which was somehow would have managed to kill all 6 people plus the driver, plus set 3 blocks on fire, and then the car would explode. And, you know, in some way, I think there might be a bit of truth to that. But, you know, fundamentally, I think there are these deeper questions about our explicit values, which we never really list explicitly, of like A is more important than B by this much. You know, we don't have a good grasp on that, which again, moving forward, we probably should.
Yes, indeed. So now let's open up the floor to any other questions or comments.
Yeah. I got to say, it's a pleasure listening to Benjamin or Dr. Rosman talk. I agree with everything he said, as might be expected for anybody who knows me. I do think that we'll be able to replace everything that humans do, even emotions, even creativity. I think that's all coming. And the idea of these things coming is also coming pretty soon, because I think we are on an exponential growth rate here, as is something that's talked about a lot at Singularity University and Ray Kurzweil in his books. In fact, it was something that was brought up by one of our most famous economists of the modern times, John Maynard Keynes, who was the founder of Keynesian economics. In 1930, he said that in about 100 years, there'd be so much automation that we wouldn't necessarily have to define ourselves by our jobs. And he looked at that as a great time. But what he probably didn't think about, or maybe he did, but was something else that really hasn't been talked about a lot here, but is that this automation that's coming in the AI and the robotics, it's not going to be an us against them thing. It's going to be something that humans are going to want to merge with. We always want to better ourselves. So I think that's going to be one of the answers to the question about, are we going to be left behind? I don't think that's going to be the case. As you can see, companies that are already maybe in their nascent stages, but like Elon Musk with Neuralink. There's other companies out there too, but they're already trying to connect our brains directly to the cloud and to, which would ultimately be having artificial intelligence attached to us directly. So we'll have all those capabilities that you might find in AI. So I see this as a huge transformation of society, goes way beyond even some of the stuff we were discussing, because you got to look at us as becoming different too. So, you know, when we talk about what are we going to do, I think we're going to be let's just be conservative, 1,000 times smarter than we are now. And we're going to have all those things accessible to us, not to mention virtual reality worlds where we can go in there, much like we talked about Star Trek, right? Where we can go to the holodeck. So you're going to have all sorts of amazing things coming, and humans are going to be transforming. And, you know, I think Benjamin mentioned it's way down the road, but again, we're at an exponential growth rate. So way down the road may only be 20 years, 20, 30, you know, the singularity is supposed to happen in 2045. So it's quite possible that we'll see huge, huge transformations coming quickly. And another thing, you know, when you said about the idea that they asked people about these changes that were coming in, and a huge percentage were okay with it. We have to look at this generationally too, because a lot of young people are used to fast changes and technology, disrupting technology. You know, they get a new iPhone and they're used to it. You know, it's the older generation that is a little bit more reserved about it, but young generations are the ones that are coming, and they're adept at the idea of like transformation and change. They're used to it and they expect it, and it is coming. So I just think that we have to take into consideration the transformation of humans themselves with regard to the merging of these technologies, because that's a big factor that's going to change our outlook. So there will be all sorts of amazing new things that we probably aren't even thinking about right now, just because it's hard to comprehend until we get there. So it's exciting, but I really appreciate you being on today. It's just fascinating to listen to this.
Thanks so much. And I completely agree with you. And I think for me, actually, the big threat is the rate of change. That if we can anticipate it and we can get society ready for it, I think it'll be fantastic. But I think if we kind of ignore it and it ends up blindsiding us, which, I mean, when I say blindsiding us, I think many people will be anticipating it. But if governments and society itself isn't set up for it, as I say, I think if you suddenly wake up one morning and you've got an increase in like 20% unemployment rate, I think that could effectively put an end to all the exponential growth for a very long time. And I think that's, you know, I honestly see, sorry?
It might speed it up. You know, it might speed it up, right? Because that's what happened with COVID in a sense. You know, we're getting to vaccines at an exponential rate. I mean, normally these vaccines should have been taking years, according to all the scientists that do vaccine work. But they're saying, well, we're working, you know, because of the crisis. It shows that when we work together. In fact, Peter Diamandis was the one who said, he says, watch, we're gonna science, excuse my, I don't want to say French, excuse my English here. He says, we're gonna science the shit out of this. What he meant, of course, was that all the scientists in the world and in the countries, since we all have a vested interest in this, we're all gonna get together, and sure enough, that's kind of what's happening. So yeah, I think you're right about the concern, but I do think it might help bring this all together.
But I think there's two notable differences to the COVID situation. So the one there is that people have an expectation that this is a short-term problem. You know, whether even if it amounts to being 2 years that it's really affecting us. You know, people are easily like everybody's imagining a point where we go back to the way it was, which won't be the case if like you've got large layoffs as a result of automation, because then I think people aren't primed for that, and I think they'll just end up being really ticked off about it and really like the system's cheating us kind of a vibe. The other thing is that the acceleration in technology for vaccinations, again, this is something that we've got a lot of prior knowledge and understanding that this is the way you get rid of diseases. Whereas, you know, something like this kind of technological revolution is something completely new. And it's something that, again, my concern was that a lot of people poo-poo it. And they're like, no, don't worry, everyone will just be software engineers. And, you know, they're the kind of people that tend to not think about these long-term implications. And I think that's the risk, that if you haven't set expectations right and people aren't understanding what this transformation's like, and partially because you have a lot of people sitting at conferences saying how, you know, everybody must just automate twice the amount they automated last week, and then we'll automate some more, and, you know, more garbage talk around that. And I think then you're not putting people in the right frame of mind to actually honestly address the problem and anticipate what's coming. And I think that's where the threat is actually.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, it is about transforming the way we think from being linear thinkers to more of an exponential thinkers. Yeah. And I do think that that's going to just probably almost organically happen in a way, because it's going to be forced upon us much the way a lot of things are happening. You know, like I said, with COVID, I'm doing way more, things online, conferences, everything's online now. And we just watched for the last couple of days, this last week, that the Democratic National Convention was all online. And you know what? It was really effective. It was very efficient. And it was a lot more cost effective, according to what I heard from the political strategists. I don't think we're going back. I think people think they're going to go back, but I think there's going to be a lot of transformations that are going to change here. I do think we're going to be finding cost effectively. It's a lot better to do things online that we didn't expect to do. And I think it accelerated because of this. But you're right. I mean, people need to start to think about that, and they need to be prepared for it. But that's why I also think, the idea of getting our brains attached to the internet is a good thing, because it's going to make us smarter. We'll have access to information a lot faster, which is what everybody wants. I mean, historically speaking, we didn't want to keep our computers on our desktops at home, so we invented laptops to bring them with us. And then we had to have them even more convenient. So now they're just pocket sized, right? Pretty soon we're going to want them in our heads, so we don't even have to deal with that. And that's going to transform us in ways there's where the singularity is going to come. But when we do transform and we have, say, nanobots glommed onto our neurons, and we start to think thousands of times faster, well, all sorts of transformations are going to occur, because communicating by way of vocal cords is going to be a bottleneck. Excuse the slight pun. So, we're going to want to be able to start to just communicate to our fellow cyborgs around the world. And again, this isn't 100 years down the road. If Kurzweil's correct, and I tend to believe that he is, these are all coming pretty soon. So you're right. People need to start to, that's part of why we exist as the USTP. I mean, we want to be able to have representatives that can be out there and talking about these things to the people. I think one of the other things about COVID that happened that's important, if you've noticed, when this crisis really came to the forefront of everybody's attention in the media and on newscasts, and then the president was going to have his daily talk or his weekly talk about this. Well, after a while, people realized he didn't know what he was talking about, or he was giving really bad advice. So what happened, you saw the public just started like, hey, what about that guy over there next to you, that Dr. Fauci? He seems like he knows what he's talking. In other words, society started to turn towards science for answers, and not, just bloviated personalities. Apologizing about me now, but what I'm saying is they wanted science people, and then the appreciation for science to be the answer for our problems is something that is going to become more and more acclimated in our society, because we're going to say, yeah, wait, maybe science is the way to go. Earlier, I think one of the other talkers was mentioning how you go to a doctor, you want to have the human touch and all that. I'll be honest with you, radial keratotomy was the beginning for when they were doing the incisions on people's corneas so they could see better. That was originally done with a scalpel. And then they said, wait a minute, we can do it with lasers, 10 years later, approximately, and it became called LASIK. And it's a way more effective. And I'm sure if you ask somebody, well, would you rather have that human touch cutting your eye up with a scalpel, or would you like to have laser? I have a feeling people are going to choose laser. So I'm just saying that all these things are coming, and I agree with you. People do need to be prepared. But I'm excited about it. And I do think younger generations are going to be a lot more likely to adapt, just because they already have. So we'll see how it goes. But yeah, it's exciting.
Yes, and Charlie, you make good points here, including about the generational differences. Going back to one of the threads in this conversation, which is, what sense of meaning will replace this association that some people have between their identities and their jobs? I found in my various conversations, most people say who are 35 or under today don't really have that sort of inextricable association between themselves and their jobs, particularly because that generation came of age during repeated economic crises. And actually having someone like me who has been with the same organization for 11 plus years is a rarity with my generation. But there are people in older generations whom, when I express, for instance, my desire to retire in my late 40s, and I say, I'm not going to stop working per se. I'm just not going to work for money. And some of them say, what are you talking about? That's the age when you start getting your prime earning potential. Or they're saying, well, I want to work for money because it gives me a sense of meaning, a sense of dignity, a sense of identity. I've met people who were in their late 60s and who retired from a particular job, and then a year or two later, they decided to come back to that job, not because they were running out of money, clearly they were financially well off, but because they didn't know what to do with their lives. And unfortunately, sometimes those jobs weren't ideal. And I know of one person who he had heart problems. He retired from his job. He came back to that job a couple years later. And then all of a sudden I find out that he died. And clearly the job didn't kill him, but probably it wasn't the best life experience for him to spend the last few years of his life in that sort of situation. So I wonder what could be done to shift that sense of meaning in people, to get rid of this association of one's core self with a particular place of employment or a particular career, a particular set of tasks that one does, and regain more of that multifaceted, more flexible sense of a human being is capable of many different pursuits. And there needs to be a kind of stable core of values, ideas, preferences, but not just what do you do for 8 hours a day every day.
Exactly. I think that's kind of a critically important question here. And it's not one that I think I've got a good answer for. I think fundamentally, if you give people the opportunity, they can answer that question themselves. And possibly what stops them doing it is just that overwhelming sense of insecurity, of like, oh, panic, 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 I have to make money somehow, panic, and I think it's just such a foreign concept that why wouldn't you have to do that is just, that does not compute. And I think if possibly with better frameworks, again, with, as things like UBI are starting to get spoken about more, the frameworks are becoming a little bit more mature, people are starting to experiment with them. I think with more of that, it becomes less of what people perceive as just a ridiculous question. What would I do with myself? Don't be ridiculous. I've got to go back to work. And, I get bored after 2 weeks of holiday. So that's just incomprehensible. But I think, this is why the whole thing feels quite well packaged together, that it's, if you can get people into that space where they can actually entertain this as something they could potentially think about. Maybe an approach to get there is, as I said earlier, you can reduce the amount of hours one is expected to work in a week without reducing their pay. Maybe you can slowly start reducing the retirement age. Again, you can't just do this in any of these things in isolation, because that ends up just putting people in more difficult positions. But if you kind of had it with the right kind of policies in place, that, at some point people are thinking, hang on, I can now retire at 50. All right, I've got to start thinking about that from an earlier age. What would I do with, what now might ultimately be the other half of my life, or something like that? And so I think people are capable of answering these questions themselves. I just think they're never put in a position where it makes sense to ask it. And fundamentally, these are things that, as I said, should be discussed at even a school level, that people should start thinking about what is meaning in my own life from very early on. This should never be a thing that's a difficult question to answer, but unfortunately for probably almost everyone, if someone asks it to you, it's a bit taken off back foot, and you got to think about it for a while, even if you're in the space of thinking about this kind of thing. And I think maybe it's just more about normalizing that is a reasonable question to be asking. In fact, it's the kind of thing you should be asking yourself. You deserve to be asking, what would I actually like to be doing with my life, rather than what have circumstances pushed me into that I have to do in my life because I don't really have an option.
Yes, indeed.
Can I say a few things?
Yes, please.
Yes. So thank you for all these interesting discussions. It's quite interesting. I have three or four remarks or questions. So maybe the first one. At this moment, the best robot in the world is still not able to open a door, to go up the stairs, and to take a glass of water like a child of 3 years old, 3 years old child. When do you think this is going to change, and do you think that it is going to change very fast, or that it's going to take a few years? Because of course, for the blue collar workers, we need these robots able to do really everything. That's my first question remark. The second one is in the, let's say, white collar world, we use more artificial intelligence than ever. We are working faster and better than ever. But on the other side, the society is more complicated than ever. So the number of people working is not at all going down. So how, yeah, I have the impression that it's really a way that the society is working, and working in a bad direction. So how could we change this? Then I had one remark that automation, if we can have automation working really good, it would mean that we would have less competition to have production, and it is good in an environmental way, because it means that there is no more, if people are not more working, are not more obliged to work, they are not more obliged to sell. So I think this is a positive aspect. And the last point is, it is not because we can stop to work that we will be obliged to stop to work. So we can imagine that some part of the society, in some part of the society, people will decide to continue to work just because they, let's say, they want it. Yeah, that's. Do you think that it's going, that this is a possibility or not? So these are the 4 remarks or questions.
Cool. So I think, yeah, thanks for that. Going to the first one, I think that's a very interesting question about how these kind of learning systems work. We're kind of at the point now where if there's a problem we want to solve or automate, we know if you put a big enough team behind it and enough money, it will happen. And I think my favorite example of this is AlphaGo, or playing the board game of Go, which, you know, in the decades before that, it was always seen as one of the grand challenges of AI and something that was way beyond our grasp. And, you know, the technologies that were used there, many of them had been around in different forms for a while, but it really took a big concerted effort to come together and solve the problem. And I think we're kind of at that point now that if someone's sufficiently motivated, we can solve for a problem. But as you point out, that's not really the interesting thing. The interesting thing is more this idea of so the field that focuses on this kind of decision making is called reinforcement learning, and it's kind of learning from reinforcement. It's about learning behaviors. And the sub question there, which is actually where a lot of my own personal research fits, is called transfer learning, which is, if I can learn to solve one problem, can I transfer that knowledge to solve a different problem? And this has been a trend. This was something that there were a few of us working in this space for a while, but really in the last not even 2 years, this has become a major research theme. So there's a lot of work now in saying, can I get my intelligent agent, whatever it might be? So typically not so much on robots yet. This is sitting more in the kind of algorithmic space at this point. But if it can learn to solve one problem, can I then leverage that to solve problem number 2 faster? And then ultimately, if I've solved n problems, I should be able to solve problem n+1 really quickly, based on the work I've done previously. And so, like, even in the kind of work we're doing in our lab, we've come up, just as one example, with a theoretical model that allows you, if you've solved n problems before, you for free are able to solve effectively a super exponential number of problems based on those initial n that you've solved. So there's now a big drive in the research agenda to get into this, and that's where you're going to start seeing these more general purpose problems, because I think a lot of people are convinced that we've now got a good handle on how to solve an individual problem. There's still challenges around this, and actually ties to one of your other comments around things like an environmental footprint. So some of these very complicated models that are being used now, the kind of models that can only be trained by teams at places like Google that have practically infinite compute. The problem is to train some of these models. There was a paper out last year or something where they showed one of the big models that was getting like a lot of press at the time did something like produce the equivalent carbon that 4 cars would over their lifetimes or something, which is ridiculous. So, you're training these huge AI models. It's actually, not really environmentally friendly. But so kind of off the back of that, there's now a lot of initiatives in various research communities for that and for other reasons, just to make these things tractable, of saying, okay, can we build models now that are more efficient, that rather than you needing a huge amount of online compute, you could maybe just do this with a couple GPUs that you might reasonably have in a research lab. And ultimately, there's even this area called machine learning on the edge, which is how do you do these kind of things with the kind of compute capabilities you would have on a cell phone. And so that's tied into all of this. There's in research is typically this idea that you want to find some solution to the problem, like, okay, it's doable. But then the rest of the community then jumps on that and spends a huge amount of effort over the next few years trying to be able to solve that problem efficiently. And I think with a lot of these things, we're in the point of making those kinds of transitions to, like, someone with like infinite compute has shown that it is possible to do this, but that's only available to a couple of the biggest research labs, and everybody else is like, cool, can we take the insights from this and now turn it into a thing that's far more widely usable? And I think that's kind of where a lot of this is going. The timeframes, obviously, in all of these things are hard to judge, but I think this is going to be the kind of space where we see a large number of breakthroughs happening over the next 2-3 years.
So there was also a point concerning the fact that my impression, at least, is the society, each time that we use artificial intelligence and each time that we use automation, we create in the society new rules to make the society more complicated. And so one of the results is, then in our world today, there are not less people in our world, in the US, in Belgium, in France. There are as much people working than 20 years ago, and there is a lot less that it's really necessary. That's for me one of these. It's really a mystery because nobody has something to win, but the situation is there. Let's take the even in the banks, where you never go anymore in the bank to take money there. You go okay, but still there are almost as much people now working there than 20 years ago. So how is this possible to change?
I think it depends kind of where you look in what industry. So and again, I think these are the kinds of things that either take a long time to change, but you could also find some changes that happen overnight. So for example, I work with a lot of the banks here, and there's now automation pretty much everywhere, but it's, they're more like a team will get together to work on a project, but 1 or 2 phases down the line of that project, it'll be in the point where, okay, now this can handle our call centers. We don't actually need to use a call center. So I think a lot of that is approaching its tipping point. But what you're also seeing now, and this talks to kind of the disruption that we often talk about in the Singularity University universe, is around things like, we then also see that there's new banks that have started up, where instead of them having thousands and thousands of employees across the country, there's a handful of employees, and the bulk of them are around developing a good tech platform, so that we've now got banks here that don't have branches at all, and everything is just done through an app. I believe there's similar things in the UK and so on. And so these things they've got much lower overheads, and you could imagine over the next few years that kind of company completely destroys the traditional company that was employing many thousands of people. And when that company goes under, then there's a ton of people that firstly not just that they don't have work, but now if you've been in banking for your whole life, kind of regardless of your age, and now, we're not at this point yet, but you could well imagine at some point that those people aren't needed in any company. And then it's not just that you got fired, but your entire industry is put out of work. And yeah, while I think that, we're not there yet, there's clear signs that that's coming. I think it's only a matter of time.
If I can say, my point is, I think that it would be already possible in the with the technology of today to have, let's say, for white collar people, maybe 30% of the work that people are doing now, you know. So I'm not sure at all that in a few years, if there is more automation, more artificial intelligence, the society will not find other ways to create jobs. I'm not sure at all because I'm older than you, and I know that there are people saying, well, it's for within a few years, since at least 20 or 30 years. But we will see, of course. Maybe you're right, but I don't have this impression.
Yeah, I think it still comes down to the standard ideas of the singularity and what that implies. And when you look at any change from a close enough scale that looks linear, you have to, but linear becomes exponential very quickly. And I think what I'm basing a lot of my comments here on is the idea that kind of fundamentally at a philosophical level, I don't see there being any skill that some law of the universe should govern that humans would do better than machines, right? Because even if you need a huge amount of compute to solve a problem as well as a human does, you can then double the amount of GPUs on the thing and increase the speed at which it works. It can run orders of magnitude more simulations than a person can. And so I think it then tips over very quickly to, once a machine can solve a problem that a human can solve, it's trivial to do it considerably better or faster.
All right. Well, now I think is a good opportunity to ask Art Ramon, do you have any questions or comments for Dr. Rosman?
As far as UBI, I think it would be great here in the US if you were to combine UBI with slavery reparations. And that could also be done worldwide to other disadvantaged people. But the phased approach of giving UBI to people who are out of work and people who are descendants of slaves, and it would settle that issue of slavery reparations and hopefully help heal people, and we can unite and move forward and become transhumans.
That's a very interesting idea, and I think there's a lot of scope to think about how UBI could be used for a whole lot of these different, like that kind of aim that you could try and include into it. And that feels like the right way to do it. If you've got because clearly it's a big infrastructural project to set something up that could handle UBI. You'd have to, I don't know the US system specifically, but to put the mechanisms in place to be able to give that kind of payouts, I think you could certainly use the same system, and probably should use the same system. If we're talking about making these kind of societal changes to basically ensure the longevity of humanity and not just that it survives, but that it thrives, that's exactly the kind of problem that you want to tackle. So I think that's absolutely something that should be explored. I'm not a UBI expert, but it seems like that would fit together perfectly.
One of the innovations that the US Transhumanist Party is advocating for in the realm of UBI is essentially a tax-free universal basic income, where we don't have to raise taxes on any segment of the population to fund it, because we could fund it through a federal land dividend, where essentially the United States has vast amounts of unused federally owned land, and that could be leased to private corporations with some environmental stipulations, and the proceeds from those leases could be used to pay a universal basic income. There could be some variation perhaps in how much a given individual might receive as compared to another, though that would complicate the system, of course. The advantage of a pure UBI is that everyone gets the same amount no matter who they are, and that forms that kind of basic floor. But one could consider, for instance, what if one involves, say, Native American reservations in the mix, and makes an offer to a Native American tribal leadership saying, well, if you allow your land to be leased for this purpose, then your tribe is going to get something extra for that in addition to the UBI. That could be another way of looking at it. But we are all about considering win-win solutions. So how do we get to the point where we facilitate universal prosperity, and if somebody is disadvantaged, we facilitate getting that person up to a level where there are no impediments to that person's opportunities, but at the same time, how do we do that without depriving somebody else of something? So that, I think, is an area where automation can play a tremendous role, because automation increases the size of the pie for everybody, potentially.
And actually does it in an interesting way, because, you know, if you're effectively, your taxable base, you know, based on what I've been talking about here, would be decreasing. You want to find a way that UBI still becomes sustainable, even if you were to ultimately end up at a point where nobody's doing work that could be taxed.
Yes,
And I think
indeed.
that's an interesting technical challenge.
Absolutely. And I think there are some countries that may have an easier time with it, countries that are resource rich. For instance, Norway, in part, has already been able to fund a lot of its social services, not out of tax revenue, but out of oil revenue. And of course, we're seeing a boom in the United Arab Emirates, for the same reason. I know they're trying to diversify their economic base, but a lot of their initial prosperity was made possible due to oil revenues. So I think that's something. I think that's something for a lot of countries to consider. How can they harness their natural resources in order to provide this level of economic security for their populations going forward? So now let us go to Pavel. Pavel, do you have any questions, comments for Dr. Rosman?
Sure. I have a... Oh, first, Benjamin, thank you so much for coming in. It's an honor to have you here. I have a cultural and technical question. First, the cultural. I think it was asked in many forms, but I will try. In different cultures, there's different concept of work. And for example, in Russia, everyone considers the work as necessary evil. I think it's because the heritage of the Soviet Union, where everyone was mandated to work. And but in US, work considered as a privilege. And even if you working for minimum wage, which is not really pay all the bills, you still have to be grateful that you have this job. And the question, I think here we face the similar problem as with aging. We challenge the ethical system which was in place since Neolithic revolution, and the question is, how can we override it to, like, ethics would match technological development? And the second technical questions, it's about AGI and machine learning. You know, there's a big hype about GPT-3 and how magical it is, how, I don't know, it can write almost like a very good look in scientific papers. Like, it can write code. I read the blog post by Ben Gersel about GPT-3 and how it's not really related to AGI. He said that GPT-3 lack of symbolic grounding, which means it's not it's failed to connect general to the particular. And it's funny, they give GPT-3 a simple algorithmic problem, something like reverse the array of numbers, and it fails to do that because it fails to understand the problem. So what do you think about architecture of the AGI, and can modern machine learning lead us to AGI, or we need a completely different architecture?
Well, that's a great question. And obviously, I think if we knew the answer, it would be worth a lot of money. So okay, just going to the first one, just kind of the cultural perceptions of work. I mean, to some extent, I think those are just the different stories we tell each other in different parts of the world to motivate people to work, because it's inherently a thing that people kind of deep down know that they don't want to be doing and shouldn't be doing. As for changing the perceptions, I think, again, this is the very hard question, and it's just going to require more discussions around the point and more of a front that people see it as actually a feasible possible future rather than something that's off the back of sci-fi, which I think is how most people view these kinds of philosophical discussions that come out of tech in any way. So I think that really is the big challenge in that space. Moving to the technical one, I mean, yeah, so there's obviously a lot of questions with something like GPT-3. So, there's a lot of hype and it can do a lot of cool stuff, but obviously it is very limited. And there's, with these kinds of very complex neural nets, it's not even always clear exactly. I mean, most of the time it's very hard to see exactly what it has learned. And there's some discussion around that. I mean, at a technical level, a model with that many like free parameters in it, effectively, to some extent, it can do a lot of memorization, and it's hard to tease apart, like, what has actually been learned above there. I think, there's a lot of different schools of thought of what these systems are actually missing. The challenge is always that we don't have good metrics for when we've hit the right thing. It's that kind of elephant test of we'll know it when we see it. And I think that's it's quite difficult to make progress with something like AI research when you don't really know exactly how to characterize the kind of the end game. My personal feeling is that there's probably several different routes one could take to get to AGI. There's certainly enough evidence that, there is evidence that, there's a single learning, there's the single learning rule hypothesis, which is that, the entirety of the brain uses the same learning rule throughout it. And that seems to be suggestive of like things like neural nets being the way to go. But then, a lot of people push back and say the way that we train neural networks are completely biologically implausible, or they're very bad abstractions of what happens biologically. So there's a few schools of thought. You mentioned specifically symbolic reasoning, and it's interesting. That's something that was the way to do AI in like the 60s through to about the 80s, which is now what we call, very tellingly, good old-fashioned AI. And the problem was that way of doing things is very fragile, right? So if the world doesn't fit very neatly into the set of like structured, like logical statements that you've got, then your system breaks. But having said that, those kinds of systems did really good work on, even flying spacecraft. So there was a lot of progress made there. Then people kind of jumped ship for machine learning and more with like the connectionist philosophies, which is more this neural network type idea. And very recently, in the last few years, people have started. There was always this idea of how do we bridge between the two ways of thinking, and there's also been a lot of like research in cognitive science and places like that, trying to understand what people do. And so now that like people are exploring quite actively again, and including some of the work we're doing, different ways of bridging the gaps, because it feels like I find it hard to figure out exactly where like this could be happening in the brain, but it's clear that having these more abstract, more symbolic ways of reasoning are useful for a couple of ways. One, in terms of long-term reasoning, effectively, this is where, if you've got a very limited working memory, you can only store a few concepts in your working memory at once. This is why in certain cultures it makes sense to have, however many words for snow, or however many words for different kinds of greens or something, because you don't want to say, well, it's that kind of snow that it's dangerous to be outside, but afterwards it's very good to go fishing, right? That just wastes your entire like working memory. You can't hold more complicated thoughts in memory if you've got to waste it all describing one thing. That the second you replace it with a single concept or word, like now that's just reduced to one slot. So now I can reason in a more complex way because I've got the rest of my memory free. So it's clear that there's values for that in terms of complicated planning, and it's clear that there's values in terms of communication, right? The fact that I can just use words and speak them and you understand what I mean, and so do everybody else on the call, like, is a huge power that this kind of symbolic reasoning has, which doesn't seem to, you get these kind of approximations to it in different kinds of neural networks. But I think there's a lot of work that has to be done in actually understanding how that works, so we can actually capture it in the right way to give us the right kind of benefits, which presumably would then address some of those problems we spoke about earlier around the amount of data you need to learn, the amount of compute you need to learn, and so on. So I think there's still quite a bit of work that's got to be done there. Although there are people already saying that they think it's conceivable we've developed all the appropriate technologies we need to. We just have to find the right way of stitching them together. I'm not quite sure where I stand on that. I feel like there's still some breakthroughs that have to happen, but I can't imagine there's too many of them.
All right. So now we've come to a point in our conversation where I understand it's almost midnight in South Africa. So I'm going to ask each of our remaining U.S. Transhumanist Party officers to provide their closing statements regarding any aspect of the salon today that they would like to comment on further. And then afterward, as is our custom, we will have our guests provide the last word. So Dr. Rosman, think about how you want to conclude this extensive experimental virtual enlightenment salon. But for now, let's go to Charlie Cam.
Yeah, and again, thank you so much, Benjamin, for this really great talk. I think what I'd like to address a little bit was the UBI thing that we've been talking about just now. Another thing that I bring up often when people talk about UBI, it's debated that it's very expensive, and that's one of the reasons people can be against it. But automation is coming, and there is going to be also this economy of abundance as we can mass produce things. And the other thing that is happening, and it's going to be refined even more and more, are 3D printers and molecular manufacturing devices. And when those things are cost effective and the price point for those individual units are to the point that they're almost cheaper than cell phones or whatever, that's the kind of thing that you can supplement a UBI to offset the expensive costs. So instead of giving a person just cash, you're basically giving them a machine that can mass produce things that they need, whether it's food or clothing or anything that they would need. And that's something that's coming because there's a lot of companies working on that. And that'll get refined, and it'll be to the point that it'll really help our economy in amazing ways. And it's also happening for housing. There are companies that are building homes for just a few $1,000s, and there are 3-bedroom homes, and it's pretty amazing that it's happening, and it's happening worldwide. So technology will offset a lot of the costs on these things, and I think that's an important aspect that has to be addressed. So when we discuss all of these new ideas, it's really tricky because we're just mere humans. We don't have the AGI in our heads yet, but it's hard. We have to grasp and we have to wrap our heads around all of the different variables and aspects that are out there because they're all important. That's where we need AI to kind of assimilate all this and put it out there for us, because those are the kind of things that are going to help transform society. And we really have to pay attention to all of them at the same time as they progress so we can implement them quickly. I think if you want to get people's mindset about not having to work, look at what we do now. When a person, you tell them, hey, we got some new technology, so, we're going to give you a raise. We're going to give you a raise, and you don't have to work as long this week. You only have to work 3 days. You have to use what people are used to in their way of thinking. And the raise wouldn't necessarily come from the company. It could be from the government if we have UBI. So there's all sorts of ways to approach it as long as it's about, everything comes down to marketing, right? So that's kind of what it is. But again, it's kind of what the USTP's platform is about UBI. And as Gennady pointed out, the federal land dividends, but in the future, there will be the supplementing by way of refined 3D printers and molecular manufacturing devices. So I just wanted to leave with that. But again, thank you for that great talk today, Benjamin.
Yes, indeed. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we all had in our homes essentially the equivalent of a Star Trek replicator for our basic material needs? So thank you, Charlie, for those comments. And Peter Zing says in the chat, good point from Charlie on how the convergence of exponential technologies will change our assumptions on how the future unfolds. So thank you, Peter. And now let's go to Art Ramon for his closing remarks.
As far as UBI, I'm hoping that a lot of the funding is going to come from resources from the moon, like helium-3, which is supposedly a great power source. So yeah, we got to get those robotic systems up on the moon mining for helium-3 so they could pay for UBI, because I want to quit working and just do art full time. So, but thank you for coming, Ben, and giving us your insight. Thank you.
Yes, and this is a good point because it speaks to the convergence of emerging technologies. This is why the US Transhumanist Party advances technological progress in all areas, not just in one area, because we see the potential for future synergies. So with space colonization, we could get resources brought back to Earth that could indeed elevate the standard of living for humans and make UBI programs more feasible from a resource standpoint. So I'm glad that you brought that into the conversation. Now, Pavel, what are your closing remarks?
I think it was the highest populated Enlightenment Salon we have so far. I'm looking forward to use technology to improve condition of our existence, and UBI is one of this option which we can implement to reduce suffering and elevate so many people towards the brighter future. And life extensive technology can elevate people out of nothingness, out of death. So I'm looking forward to promote this mindset of the positive and optimistic future where we can improve condition of everyone by implementing technologies. That's what transhumanism is. And yes, thank you so much everyone who's been on a call. We all heroes. Yes, thank you everyone.
Yes, indeed. And thank you, Pavel, for all the work that you've done behind the scenes, not just in streaming this, but also in connecting us with our guests for today's salon. I think it turned out really well. Perhaps the best simulacrum we've had of the historic Enlightenment salons where people from a variety of occupations and interests would come together into the same hall in a mansion or a palace and would discuss these kinds of issues, sometimes coming in and out. I think this definitely is a format that we could expand upon, and this was a great proof of concept for this kind of event. Now,
yes, I think that's what we should do. Like when I said before, we should reach out to each other, we should know each other. That's what I'm trying to do to help transhumanists and people who like transhumanism to come together and just see each other's face and know that we are there and we can work together.
Absolutely, absolutely. So here's to more of that kind of collaboration. Cheers with my glass of water. And Charlie with his Ray Kurzweil mug.
It's Kurzweil for President 2045. So.
Nice. Well, that may well transpire. The USTP will be around, I hope, and Ray will be around in good health, and we might approach him. So now with that, Dr. Rosman, let us have the final word from you regarding any aspect of the conversation you want to comment on or any additional statements you would like to make.
Well, firstly, I mean, again, it's just such an honor to be here, and this is such a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and it really is an awesome format. This is something I haven't been involved in something like this before, but it's, I think, a really effective way of discussing ideas. Thanks so much for that, and really for the honor. And yeah, I think my last point is just to kind of bring it all together and say, you know, there's a lot that's happening in a lot of different technological fields at the moment that's really exciting. There's a lot of really cool developments that are coming or have come and just that are in a very kind of local scale in a small way changing their corner of the universe and making these small changes. But one of the common points to what's been discussed here is that also brings with it the opportunity for us to really question some of the fundamental ideas and assumptions of human life and society, and whether that's, you know, dying from natural deaths or that we need to work for a living. I think that's really where we need to be focusing our efforts, is to say, given these things and the small changes they make in our everyday lives, what new opportunities do they buy us for these fundamental changes to really dramatically reduce human suffering and increase human flourishing?
Yes, and that is an excellent way to bring it to a conclusion. All of these discussions are indeed focused on reducing human suffering and increasing human flourishing. So thank you, Dr. Rosman, for being with us today. Thank you to our US Transhumanist Party officers, to our colleagues from AFT Technoprog, to Liz Parrish, to Jose Cordero, to the California Transhumanist Party for being with us. And I remind all of our attendees, we have these virtual enlightenment salons on a weekly basis. So tune in next Sunday. We're going to continue this pattern of multifaceted, stimulating, thought-provoking conversations. And until then, live long and prosper.